Hello, welcome back. It's Steve Smith here again, and this is my 9th presentation, and the topic today is audiolingual drills, drilling. Just before we start, there's my Twitter handle and the address of my blog, and a reminder about informedlanguageteacher.com, where you can find readings, podcasts and videos about language teaching. Sometimes it's very easy as a language teacher to go along with the latest trend. There's a strong bandwagon effect in teaching, isn't there? And particularly language teaching. And sometimes it's useful to revisit practices of the past and see whether there's things that we can learn from them. And sometimes a language method comes and goes and we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'd like to suggest today that we can look at audiolingual drills and find a justification for using them. And as with many language practices, so much about the success of them is in the delivery. Can they be done well? So let's have a look at audiolingual drills. Firstly, they were based on a particular view of learning, the behaviourist view of learning. If you look at that chap down there, B.F. Skinner, he was a psychologist who did experiments on learning, known for his Skinner boxes, for example, where he would train animals, for example pigeons, to perform certain actions. For example, they would walk around following a trail of seed, and if they did this enough times and then you took the seed away, they would carry on walking the same route, so that creatures can learn things simply by repetition. They become conditioned to behave in a certain way. Actually, if you're a language teacher and you have a regular entry routine for your class, for example, they march in, stand by their desks, and then you say, sit down. And if you do that every day for 10 days, by the end, the students will come in, they will sit down, and then you might have a student who says, what did you tell us to do just now? And you ask them, what do you think? Oh, sit down. And they've worked out that the phrase you used meant sit down because they just repeated it. So the behaviourist strand is quite strong in learning still, even though it's gone out of fashion. As far as language is concerned, the idea was that a language is just a set of habits that are stamped in, was the phrase they use, stamped in through repetitive practice. So if you hear things repeatedly and you repeat themselves, then they will somehow become internalized in your brain. In the days when audiolingualism was in its pomp, perhaps in the sort of 50s, let's say, into the 60s, the emphasis was on accurate repetition. The emphasis was on oral work. The role of communication, genuine communication, was limited. A lot of the exercises that were done were based on somewhat random sentences which were there to demonstrate grammatical forms or vocabulary. The role of the written word was relatively limited, so in that sense it seemed modern at the time because it was about speaking, and it seemed very different to the grammar translation method. And we can't forget here the influence of technology. For example, the invention of the tape recorder was massively influential, because once you had that technology there, it became possible to use tapes to encourage listening and repetition. With that in mind, that picture on the right there is a reminder of what a language lab looks like today. When I was aged 13, we had booths similar to this, but with reel-to-reel tape decks, and then later they became cassettes, and now of course they're computers. But the idea was that you would sit in your booth and you would listen, repeat, and so on. So what do we mean by a drill? Well, at the very simplest, we've got the repetition drill. That's where you simply listen to a model from the teacher or from a tape and simply repeat it. So the teacher models the word and students repeat. At a slightly more complex level, we have what are called substitution drills. So substitution drills are when you give the model and then the students have to change one item in the model. And then we have question and answer drills, which I talked about in my last presentation, which are somewhat more communicative, but still have a very repetitive nature and artificial nature to them. So at a very simple level, if we look at this example at the bottom, the prompt, the model from the teacher might be, I go to work. He, and the response, he goes to work. So you can see it's a very limited, mechanical sort of drill in that case. But they can be more interesting than that. Now, what's interesting is that these days, with the interest in cognitive psychology and issues such as repetition, the spacing effect, forgetting rates, and so on, that you begin to see audiolingual drills in a different light. Is what used to be called stamping in, is this effectively the same as automatizing knowledge? In other words, you repeat something, you think about it, and then gradually by practice it becomes part of your procedural memory. You just do it without thinking. Perhaps the main difference is that these days we have a less passive view of learning. Behaviourism seemed to see human beings as passive objects who played no role themselves in the learning. And when Chomsky came along and wrote his book Syntactic Structures in 1957, Skinner was criticised for neglecting the creative role of the human in the learning process. But when you look at it this way, then this is probably why some types of drill-like activity have come back into fashion. For example, in the case of knowledge organizers, when people do lots of repetitive reading exercises, or with sentence builders, for example, where there's lots of built-in repetition. So let's have a look at a typical substitution drill, and this is something I would have used in my teaching. This one's in French, but it's easy to see what's going on. So today I'm playing football, today I'm travelling by train, today I'm finishing my homework, today I'm choosing a biscuit, today I'm selling my bike. So certainly this one meets the criterion of having fairly random selection of language, although it is high frequency language. And when doing a drill like this, I think one thing to say is that you want to make sure that the vocabulary contained in the prompts is familiar, it's comprehensible already. Because in this case, we want the focus to be on the verb form. So we're chunking verb forms here, and we're going to get students to move from I'm playing football to yesterday I played football. So in this case, the prompt would be today I'm travelling by train, and we want the students to say yesterday I travelled by train. Now, if you think what's going on in a student's head at this point, provided they've already had previous considerable practice and perhaps some explanation about how the past tense works, they will hopefully have an idea of the phonological difference between je joue and j'ai joué. So they're making a link between the sounds je joue and j'ai joué with the meaning of present and past. So when they have to adapt the next one, je voyage, and change it to j'ai voyagé, they are thinking, using working memory, to make that link between meaning and the sound, this et here. J'ai joué, j'ai voyagé. Now in this case I've included different types of past tense verb in French, so this one, once the students have learnt this, instead of je finis, they're going to say j'ai fini, and so on. So that's the basic principle. So you could do this as a teacher-led task, and then you could get students to do this in pairs, with one person giving the prompt, one person giving the answer. Now, you can then take that drill a little bit further and use it somewhat more creatively. So in the instance I just gave you, students would just change the tense, do nothing else. But they then could change the tense plus one other element in the sentence. So instead of saying j'ai joué au football, I played football, they might have to say j'ai joué au rugby, I played rugby. And so they could insert in that slot, rather like we do with a sentence builder, different chunks, in this case different sports, whilst constantly repeating j'ai joué. Students could also change the tense and add an extra element. For example, I played rugby and tennis. So you could say you must give 2 extra items as well as the verb. So that adds a certain amount of creativity and a demand to retrieve more lexis from long-term memory. So it demands retrieval practice that we know is important for learning. With the right classes, let's suppose you've already worked on negatives, so they could change a positive prompt to a negative. So instead of j'ai joué, they'd say je n'ai pas joué. And get that chunk there, je n'ai pas joué, repeatedly used and then gradually in long-term memory. So as I mentioned before, students could do the drill in pairs, and with good enough classes they could then make up their own examples, taking your examples further. In addition, you could read the prompt, and having practiced orally, students could then write their answer on paper or on a mini whiteboard, effectively doing the same task, but this time with a focus on written accuracy. You could even ask students to translate the prompt first so that you're absolutely clear that they've got the meaning in their heads. And then, once you've got a series of sentences together, students could make up something a bit longer. Of course, you could make sure that your drills are all focused on one particular topic area rather than be somewhat random, as in the example I showed you there. So there's a lot you can do with drills, and that drill might be the starting point for some more genuinely communicative work. So in this case, a natural follow-on would be, okay, so what did you do last weekend? And they could pick and choose from that list of sentences or make up their own. So what are the advantages then of drills? Well, they certainly give you highly patterned, comprehensible input. It's not terribly interesting input, it's true, but it is comprehensible input. They're very structured. Students know exactly what they have to do during the lesson, and that's very, very important. Confusion easily arises in language lessons when students aren't sure what they're meant to be doing. Drills clearly promote noticing. A reminder about the Schmidt noticing hypothesis. So when they're thinking in working memory about making that change to the verb, they're definitely having to focus on meaning and the form. So they are adaptable, as I've shown, and they can have a built-in progression. And to go back to the behaviourist roots, perhaps this repetition then will eventually help them internalize or automatize the rules of the language for more creative use on subsequent occasions. But don't think that happens very quickly. It can take a long time, and it might be that drills done, over a certain period, the results of that automatization might come, quite a lot later, because the brain can sometimes take a long time to consolidate memories. They do, in this case, provide a focus on accuracy. And I think particularly with beginners, I think we should emphasize accurate versions of language for long-term memory. You remember, if you looked at my presentation about the phonological loop, and having accurate representations of words and chunks in memory is so important for listening. They are intensive. They can help with pronunciation and intonation. And they're also quite a safe environment for language learners to use the language. They're not having to make up too much content themselves, but for those language learners who aren't the risk takers and the natural communicators, it is a somewhat safe, structured activity. They do also provide a chance to get instant feedback, and I think when you're doing a drilling activity, particularly with younger learners, there's a strong case for correcting in a sensitive way and to making sure that the activity is done accurately if the focus is on grammar. And remember, that's what our focus is at the moment. And don't forget, for the teacher, they can be a good way to help with your classroom management, particularly, for example, setting up the beginning of a lesson with a drill so that everyone's looking at you, you're scanning the class, they're scanning you as you try and run a lively sort of drill. They can help you recognize if any new language is causing problems, so it's feedback for you if pronunciation is faulty, for example, or if they're simply showing that they haven't got, in this case, the difference between present and past tense. They're really handy as starters, fillers or plenaries in lessons, and they do give ample opportunities for retrieval practice. So you can see, I can find a lot of positives for using drills, in moderation, no doubt, but I see a strong place for them. And within the skill acquisition model of learning, so we can say that they're an example of controlled practice which leads to automatization. Certainly the research suggests that the more meaningful we can make the drills, the better. So if they're done in context with other communicative activities, that would be great. And perhaps we should avoid totally random drills, or ones which don't require retrieval of existing knowledge. So it's often about reusing comprehensible input and be clear on the focus of the drill. So if the aim is to manipulate verbs, don't throw in other difficulties, such as sudden new words they've never seen before. That's just going to create cognitive overload. So what are the criticisms? Well, uninteresting. The content itself is not fundamentally that interesting. Sure. They're not particularly communicative. This is not real-life communication. But in response, I'd say, well, it's a classroom. It's a language learning classroom. And it's there. It's a place to model language and practice it, and sometimes to use it in a way which is somewhat like real-life communication, but that it can't be, and perhaps shouldn't be, all the time. It is based on a controversial model of acquisition for some researchers. The idea that somehow we do things repeatedly and they become automatized is not favoured by every researcher. So, is it a question of drill and kill or drill and skill? Well, I think you can see my view on that. I think there's a place for it. So I wonder if you use drills, or perhaps if you haven't used them, whether you think there's a role for them in your particular context in your school. Because, let's face it, like all language practices in the classroom, not everyone suits every context. For your further reading, there's a nice article here about drilling from the Teaching English site, the British Council, and a good SlideShare presentation based on the book by Richards and Rogers, which I can recommend to you strongly, Approaches and Methods in Language Teaching, where they talk about audiolingualism amongst many other methods. My own teacher resource website, FrenchTeacher.net, does have examples of drills, particularly for the younger learners, and these were ones often that I used myself and then subsequently put online. You can use them as printed resources, or you could simply display them on a whiteboard, which has the advantage of getting the students to look to the front rather than looking down on the paper in front of them. So that can be good as well for classroom control. So thank you very much for listening to that session, which again was focused on grammar, but in particular using drills. In the next session, I'm going to move on to vocabulary. And in the meantime, don't forget the 3 books I've been involved in, because really in these presentations I'm just showing you the tip of the iceberg here. There's so much more that I can share with you, and that my colleague Gianfranco can share with you. There are our 3 books. Do tune in again. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.